He warned them. Again and again, he warned them. A man who called himself a prophet, but whose visions were more curse than blessing. He didn't speak of kingdoms rising or plagues consuming the land. No, he spoke only of his own end, of bones scattered, of fingers missing, of his body torn apart. People laughed, some feared, but he never stopped sketching the same image. His corpse, drawn 20 years before his death, marked with the wounds he swore were waiting for him. He carried those drawings in his coat, showing them like scripture. "This is how I will die," he would whisper, forcing strangers to stare at the crude lines of a broken man, mutilated beyond recognition. Many dismissed him as insane. Yet, piece by piece, his predictions began to circle closer. Fingers lost in accidents, wounds eerily like the ones he once put on paper. Until the final day came, and his body, cold, real, blood-soaked, matched the prophecy perfectly. But here's the question. Did he see his fate, or did he summon it? They called him Matthias the Unbroken, though he was anything but whole. The name was given mockingly at first, a cruel joke among villagers who thought him mad. He was tall, with hands that trembled as though the bones themselves resisted his flesh. His eyes never seemed to focus on the present. They darted sideways, backward, as if catching glimpses of something the rest of the world had no right to see. He came from a family of masons, men who cut stone, shaped walls, and raised cathedrals that still stood long after their bones were dust. But Matthias, he abandoned the craft. He abandoned everything. The first vision came when he was young, barely 20. He woke in the night and began to draw. Charcoal in hand, he sketched feverishly, as though his fingers were possessed. What appeared was not the face of a saint or the arc of an archway. It was his own face, pale, slack, and bloodied. His left hand was mangled, 2 fingers missing, the arm twisted in a grotesque angle. Beneath the sketch, he scrawled 4 words, "This will be me." His mother tore the paper to shreds, hoping to erase the omen. But he drew it again and again, dozens of times. The same image, replicated with uncanny precision. The missing fingers, the shattered hand, the same corpse, staring back at him. Soon he carried those sketches like a priest carried relics, folded neatly and pressed against his chest. Some said he had cursed himself by putting it to paper. Others whispered that perhaps God had marked him in advance. But Matthias, he only nodded. He never denied it. Over time, his life began to bend toward the drawing. He worked with his father one summer, cutting stone. A chisel slipped. The blade tore through his hand, nearly severing a finger. The wound healed, but it left a scar so perfectly aligned with his sketches that whispers spread like wildfire. "It has begun," the townsfolk muttered. To them, Matthias was not simply unlucky. He was touched by fate. Some avoided him in fear, as though his curse might leap from skin to skin. Others clung to him, desperate to hear a fragment of their own future. Priests denounced him. They said no man could see his end unless the devil himself showed it. They tried to drive him from the village. Yet Matthias remained, wandering from tavern to market, always with those papers clutched in hand, warning anyone who would listen. "I am already dead," he told them. "I am only waiting for time to catch up. 20 years is a long time to carry your own corpse in your pocket." And in those 20 years, Matthias changed. He became gaunt, almost skeletal. His voice dropped to a rasp, yet his words sharpened like blades. Children ran when they saw him. Men spat at his feet. But women, the widows, the grieving mothers, the ones who had lost children to plagues and husbands to war, they sometimes listened. They saw in him a mirror of their own despair. He was the living embodiment of what they feared, inevitability. And still Matthias sketched. By then he had filled entire books with variations of the same ending. The body torn, the missing fingers, the blood pooling in places no artist should ever capture. Some claim that the later drawings became more exact, as though the future was sharpening, becoming clearer with each passing year. Others swore the sketches changed subtly after each new wound or scar, as though reality itself was bending to catch up with what he had first drawn. One story tells of a soldier who mocked Matthias in a tavern, calling him a fraud. Matthias did not curse or strike the man. Instead, he calmly slid a folded parchment across the table. On it was a sketch, not of Matthias this time, but of the soldier himself, dead on a battlefield, throat slashed open. The man laughed, shoved the paper back, and left. A month later, news came that he had indeed fallen in battle, throat cut by a blade. From then on, Matthias was no longer simply a madman. He was a prophet, a dangerous one. Yet the question haunted everyone. Was he predicting or was he creating? Did his visions reveal destiny or did his very belief drag it into existence? When the scar formed on his hand, when the soldier fell, when each wound began to match the sketches. Was fate tightening its grip, or was Matthias himself pulling the noose around his own neck? That question would grow darker as his final years approached. For Matthias had begun to say something new. He no longer simply showed the drawings. He began to whisper a date, the date of his death, and with each year, it grew closer. The name Matthias spread beyond his village, carried on rumor like ash on wind. Traders brought his story to distant towns, where men and women spoke of the prophet who carried his own death in sketches. Some laughed it off, calling it peasant superstition. Others whispered prayers, afraid even to say his name aloud. For wherever Matthias went, misfortune seemed to follow. He was a curse made flesh, a walking reminder that no one could outpace the grave. At fairs, children dared each other to touch his cloak, believing the one who did would never live past 40. Tavern keepers refused him entry, claiming his presence emptied their rooms. And yet, when someone lost a husband at war or a child in childbirth, they sought him, not for hope, but for confirmation. Matthias never lied to them. He did not say, "Your son rests in heaven," or "Your wife is at peace." He only said what he saw, and often what he saw was terror. Some called him a monster for it. Others began to call him prophet. The sketches grew darker in these years. In the early drawings, he was little more than a corpse. But in the later ones, details sharpened. The missing fingers became distinct, always the ring and little finger of his left hand. The face, once vague, took on angles identical to his own. The surroundings too emerged. Cobblestone streets, a wooden cart overturned, strangers in the background watching. Each new drawing contained more pieces of the puzzle, and each piece was another step closer to inevitability. One tale tells of a miller who stole a sketch from Matthias while he was drinking. The man tried to sell it, boasting that he had robbed the prophet of his doom. But when the drawing was later found, it had changed. The corpse no longer resembled Matthias. It resembled the miller, his own hand mangled, his throat cut. Within the year, the miller was found dead by the riverbank, his body eerily similar to the stolen sketch. People swore the drawings themselves carried power, as if the parchment was not ink, but fate pressed it flat. The church grew restless. Local priests called Matthias a heretic, an agent of Satan. Bishops sent letters demanding his arrest, but no court could convict him of more than madness. He broke no laws, drew no blades, spilled no blood. His crime was prophecy, and prophecy could not be chained. Some officials feared him enough to keep their distance. Others wanted him silenced. Yet Matthias, defiant, continued to wander, continued to speak, continued to whisper of the date, his date. He said it was already written. The people closest to him claimed he grew stranger as the appointed year neared. He began fasting for days, drinking only water, sketching by candlelight until his fingers blistered. He muttered to himself, carrying on conversations with voices no one else heard. Some nights he stood in the graveyard, staring at the earth as though he was waiting for it to open. "Not yet," he whispered once when a boy followed him there. "Not yet, but soon." And then, accidents. One winter, his left hand was crushed in a mason's yard where he sought shelter. The surgeons saved it, but 2 fingers were badly damaged, blackened and twisted. He carried them useless at his side and the town gasped. It was the sketch made flesh. Matthias showed no fear. Instead, he smiled. "The wheel is turning," he told them. "The sketch is almost complete." His enemies claimed he engineered it all, that he had deliberately injured himself to maintain the illusion. But how then to explain the soldier's death, or the miller's, or the widow who swore Matthias told her the exact hour her infant would breathe its last, and when that hour came, the child died in her arms? Coincidence can be forgiven once, twice. But Matthias stacked them endlessly, building a monument of inevitability. And with each fulfilled vision, the fear deepened. Travelers who met him on the road described a man already half dead, consumed by his obsession. He wore his rags like burial cloth. He spoke of time not as a line, but as a cage. "We pace within it," he said once to a scholar who recorded his words, "and every cage has its end. I have seen mine." The scholar pressed him. "Then why keep drawing it?" Matthias answered, "Because the drawing is not warning. It is invitation." That single word, invitation, spread like wildfire. Did Matthias mean he invited death upon himself? Or that death invited him, as a guest long awaited? No one knew, but as the foretold year approached, fear coiled tighter around him. People began marking the date he whispered on their calendars. Some prepared pilgrimages, eager to witness the fulfillment. Others swore they would not go near the village, afraid the curse might spill onto them. And so the stage was set. A man who drew his own corpse, who lost the fingers he had already sacrificed on paper, who spoke of his last breath as though rehearsing a script. A man who was no longer mad in the eyes of the people, but something worse, something inevitable, the prophet of his own dismemberment. The final year arrived like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. The whispered date Matthias had carried for decades was now fixed on every tongue. Some repeated it with dread, others with morbid anticipation. Entire villages prepared as though awaiting an eclipse or a great storm. For years, Matthias had been spectacle and warning, but now he became destiny incarnate. People traveled miles, crossing mountains and rivers, just to glimpse the man who claimed he had seen his own corpse. Witnesses say his appearance in those last months was ghastly. His hair had thinned into wiry strands, his skin clung tight to his bones, his lips cracked until they bled when he spoke. Yet his eyes burned with a feverish clarity, as if whatever he saw beyond the veil of life was drawing closer, sharpening in detail. He walked barefoot even in the cold, muttering passages no one could understand. He carried his old sketches still, now yellowed with time, and showed them to anyone who would look. "Not long now," he whispered. "Not long." The crowds grew. On the eve of the year's end, hundreds gathered in the town square, filling taverns, barns, and church pews. Some claimed that they came to mock him. Others came to witness a miracle or a curse. Merchants sold scraps of parchment, pretending they were Matthias's drawings. Priests thundered warnings from the pulpit that Satan himself walked among them. Yet still the people stayed. A prophet's death had been foretold, and mankind's hunger for spectacle is always greater than its fear of sin. Matthias did not hide. He welcomed the gathering, as if each face in the crowd were another witness to inscribe his fate into history. He climbed the steps of a fountain and raised his mangled hand high. The two withered fingers dangled lifeless, blackened husks against his pale skin. "See," he rasped, "the drawing unfolds before you, one line at a time." Murmurs swept through the crowd. Some gasped, some jeered, but none looked away. In the final week, strange occurrences surrounded him. Flocks of crows circled the square whenever he appeared, as if nature itself marked the countdown. A butcher swore Matthias passed him and whispered the exact weight of meat he would sell that day. When evening came, the number was exact. A midwife claimed Matthias touched her hand and told her she would deliver a child that would not cry. And she did, though the infant lived. These stories spread like fire, tightening the atmosphere with a mixture of awe and terror. As the appointed night approached, Matthias grew eerily calm. He stopped muttering to unseen voices. He stopped fasting. He sat for hours in the graveyard, as though he had finally reached the place where waiting no longer mattered. Some swore they saw him smiling, though the expression was more skull than man. The date he had spoken of for decades was now only hours away. The night itself arrived like theater. Torches lit the streets. The church bells tolled, though no service was held. Hundreds crowded the square, their faces half-shadowed, their breath rising in cold clouds. Families held their children close, while drunks wagered on whether Matthias would die at all. Pilgrims wept openly, convinced they were about to see God's hand in action. Even the clergy stood at the edges, torn between condemnation and curiosity. Matthias walked among them silently, head bowed, sketches pressed to his chest. Then, just before midnight, he stopped. He turned to the crowd, lifted the parchment above his head, and shouted, "Now!" Chaos erupted. No one knows exactly what sparked it. Some say a stone was thrown, others claim a knife was drawn. But in the crush of bodies, Matthias was pulled to the ground. Witnesses recall screams, shouts, the tearing of cloth. Torches fell, carts overturned. In the frenzy, his body was trampled, dragged, and torn apart. When the mob dispersed, silence followed, broken only by the sobs of those who realized what had been done. His corpse lay in the street, mutilated, the left hand mangled, 2 fingers missing, his arm twisted unnaturally, his ribs broken, his face bloodied beyond recognition. And there beside him, scattered in the dirt, were the sketches. Each line matched to reality, as though the drawings had been blueprints for the violence that unfolded. People who saw it swore the resemblance was exact, down to the smallest details. The overturned cart, the cobblestones darkened with blood, the shadowed figures in the background. Some swore Matthias had not fought back at all, that he had gone limp, almost eager. A few even claimed he had smiled with his last breath, as if he welcomed the fulfillment. Others argued the mob murdered him in madness, and the prophecy was coincidence, twisted to fit the crime. But those who had watched him for decades shook their heads. They knew. Matthias had died exactly as he said he would. He had drawn his own ending and stepped into it willingly. In the aftermath, terror gripped the town. Some destroyed the sketches, burning them to ash, fearing the curse might spread to whoever touched them. Others hid them, treasuring them as relics of prophecy fulfilled. Priests denounced Matthias as damned, warning that his story was proof of Satan's trickery. Yet pilgrims still came, years later, to kneel where he had fallen, pressing their hands to the cobblestones as if some echo of his fate lingered there. Rumors multiplied. One widow swore she saw Matthias's shadow walking the streets the night after his death. A farmer claimed the crows that circled above descended on the square, pecking at the stones until they gleamed red. Children born that year were said to carry a mark, a faint scar across their left hands, as if fate had touched them too. Chroniclers struggled to explain it. Some wrote of mob madness, the kind that infects crowds and makes men forget themselves. Others swore Matthias provoked it deliberately, sacrificing himself to prove his visions true. A few whispered that the crowd had been possessed, that in tearing Matthias apart they were acting out a will greater than their own. Records from the church insist the drawings were gathered and destroyed, but in secret collections, copies still surface, smuggled as forbidden relics, their images as haunting as the tale itself. The most chilling detail? Witnesses swore that on the final parchment he carried, the one he raised above his head before midnight, there was not an image of himself at all. Instead, it was blank, just an empty outline of a man waiting to be filled. Some claimed the lines were invisible, waiting only for blood to make them appear. Others said the emptiness was the point. Matthias was no longer predicting. He was surrendering. He had become the prophecy. And so the mad prophet was torn apart, exactly as foretold. His life was a circle, his death its closing line. Yet questions remained, questions no sketch could answer. Did Matthias foresee destiny, or did his obsession summon it? Did the crowd kill him out of frenzy, or did they become actors in a script he had already written? And most unsettling of all, if a man can draw his death and meet it exactly, how many of us are walking toward endings already etched in lines we cannot yet see? In the weeks that followed Matthias's death, the town lived as though cursed. The square where he had fallen was washed with buckets of water, yet the stones seemed permanently stained. Mothers refused to let their children walk across it. Merchants avoided setting up stalls nearby, and travelers who arrived after the night of his dismemberment said they could still feel something in the air, as though the place had become heavier, thick with memory and dread. The church wasted no time. Priests denounced Matthias from every pulpit. He was no prophet, they thundered. He was a vessel of Satan who used fear and illusion to ensnare the weak. In sermons, they warned that prophecy itself was a temptation, that only God decides the hour of death. The bishop of the region ordered the remaining sketches collected and burned in a great pyre before the cathedral. Witnesses watched as the pages curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Yet not all were destroyed. Rumors claimed a handful survived, hidden in secret by villagers unwilling to part with the cursed relics. Meanwhile, the villagers who had known Matthias told a different story. They spoke not of Satan, but of inevitability. He knew, an old woman said. He always knew. To them, Matthias was not damned, but chosen or cursed by a power even the church could not name. Some claimed he had given them visions of their own deaths, visions that haunted them still. Others swore his shadow lingered in the alleys, walking the same routes he once did, as though he were a ghost caught in repetition. Scholars who studied the tale generations later debated fiercely. Some argued that Matthias's death was nothing more than mob violence twisted into myth. They claimed his sketches were vague enough that any violent end could be forced to fit them. Others rejected this, pointing to eyewitness descriptions that match his drawings with chilling precision. The missing fingers, the overturned cart, the posture of the corpse. Too many details, they insisted, aligned too perfectly to dismiss as coincidence. A darker theory spread that Matthias's obsession itself created the outcome. By carrying those sketches, by repeating the prophecy, he had woven his own trap. The crowd, primed for violence, became the executioners he had always drawn. In this view, Matthias was not a seer, but a man who orchestrated his own doom, whether consciously or not. And yet even this explanation leaves unease. For if words and images can summon death, then perhaps prophecy is not vision at all, but infection. Stories of Matthias spread beyond the region. Travelers carried them to distant lands. In some versions, Matthias was remembered as a saint who accepted his death with grace. In others, he was cursed, his name invoked to frighten children into obedience. Ballads were sung of the prophet of fingers, while chroniclers in monasteries recorded him only in the margins, as if even writing his story too clearly might invite misfortune. Over the centuries, his legend blurred into folklore, yet always with the same chilling thread. He drew his own end, and the world obeyed the lines. But perhaps the most unsettling part of his legacy was the effect on those who survived the night. Eyewitnesses grew haunted, plagued by dreams. One man swore he saw Matthias's face in every mirror he passed. A woman claimed her hands began to ache with phantom pain, as though her own fingers were being torn. And in taverns, when the subject arose, silence fell heavy, because too many had been there. Too many had played a part. Each villager knew they had joined the mob, if only by standing in the crowd, and perhaps that was Matthias's final curse. Not that he foresaw his death, but that he made everyone else complicit in it. Decades passed, but the memory of Matthias did not fade. His story refused burial, surfacing in whispered tales and forbidden songs. In marketplaces, peddlers sold crude copies of his sketches, claiming they carried glimpses of the buyer's own fate. Parents, desperate to frighten their children into obedience, warned them, "If you lie, Matthias will draw you." In taverns, travelers traded embellished accounts of his final night, each retelling more grotesque, each detail twisted until Matthias seemed less man than monster. The church fought tirelessly to smother his memory. Edicts were issued forbidding his name from being spoken in sermons. Monks were ordered to scrape his mention from manuscripts. But erasure only fueled curiosity. Secret sects formed in the shadows, treating Matthias as a martyr of inevitability. They claimed he was proof that man's life is already written, that choice itself is an illusion. These sects gathered at night, sketching crude corpses of themselves, daring fate to answer. To outsiders, it was madness. To them, it was devotion. In the villages nearest where Matthias died, life itself seemed bent by his legend. Children born with missing fingers were whispered to be marked by the prophet. A famine was blamed on the curse of his blood soaking the earth. And whenever violence erupted in the streets, people muttered that they had seen Matthias's outline among the crowd, guiding chaos unseen. He became less man and more omen, a shadow that lingered long after his body was gone. Travelers wrote of hearing chants about him in languages not their own. One account tells of a knight who swore he encountered a band of deserters in the forest. Before attacking him, they chanted Matthias's name as if invoking protection. Another described wandering into a ruined church where a figure had been carved into the stone wall, gaunt, fingers missing, eyes like hollow pits. The mason who built it was later arrested for heresy, but no one could explain how the carving seemed to predate Matthias himself. Philosophers used Matthias's story as a weapon in their arguments. To those who believed in free will, Matthias was a warning of delusion, a man so obsessed with his own death that he made it real. To those who argued for fate, he was the ultimate proof that a man can glimpse the script of his life, yet remain powerless to alter a single line. His legend became a mirror for the debates of the age, each side twisting his story to serve their truth. And still, the image of him, gaunt, fingerless, dismembered, haunted the imagination of all who heard it. But the most unnerving thing was this. Long after Matthias, new stories began to emerge. Other men and women claimed to dream of their deaths with the same clarity, to sketch or write or speak of wounds that later appeared. Most were dismissed as charlatans, yet a few gained followings, whispering prophecies of blood, fire, and ruin. And every time such a figure arose, people remembered Matthias. They spoke his name again, reviving the curse. For Matthias was no longer just a man or a tale. He had become a cycle. And so the story of Matthias closes where it began, with a man holding a sketch of his own corpse. But the closing of his life did not silence him. His death was too exact, too uncanny, too terrifying to be forgotten. People remembered not simply that he died, but that he had predicted the manner of it decades before. They remembered the missing fingers, the twisted arm, the blood pooling where he had drawn it. They remembered how he whispered the date again and again, until the world itself seemed to listen. What unsettles historians is not simply the accuracy of his drawings, but the way the world bent to meet them. If Matthias had been killed in a different manner, perhaps his story would have ended as another tale of madness. But the details aligned too perfectly, as though violence itself had followed his lines. The mob became his pen, the square became his parchment, and his death in the end was the drawing completed. And what of those who came after? Too many stories repeat the same pattern. A girl who dreamed of drowning and years later was pulled lifeless from a river. A soldier who claimed he had seen his own body pierced with arrows and later fell exactly that way in battle. Each tale resurrects the memory of Matthias. Each one whispers the same question. Did they predict or did they summon? The unease grows sharper when you look at our own age. Even now, people write their fears into journals, sketch the nightmares that plague their sleep, post confessions of doom across pages for strangers to read. How many of those fears will become futures? How many of those sketches will be mistaken for art until one day the lines are matched in blood? Matthias is no longer just a relic of a medieval town. He is a reminder that obsession creates gravity, and gravity pulls us down into the graves we dig ourselves. And perhaps that is why his story survives, because it is not just about him, it is about us, about the possibility that we too carry sketches of our own deaths without knowing it. Perhaps in a dream we've forgotten, in a story we once told, in a fear we keep repeating. Perhaps the future waits for us to draw the first line, and once drawn, the ending is inevitable. Matthias saw his death, and he died exactly that way. But the real horror is not that his prophecy was fulfilled. The real horror is that his prophecy might never end. It waits, patient, ready to find its next hand, its next sketch, its next voice whispering, "This will be me." So ask yourself, if Matthias could sketch his own corpse, what lines have you already drawn?